And so this is the fourth and final part of our lecture today. This is the third lecture for the series. And I'm going to spend some time on Olaoudah Equiano. And in this talk, I'm going to read some stretches of passages that I think are really important to understanding it. So just briefly, I should explain that Olaoudah Equiano, who lived most of his life, frankly, even after the publication of his major memoir, under the name Gustavus Vasa. Um, but when he was titling the book and giving the name of the author, he used his private name, Olaoudah Equiano. Olaoudah would be a Nigerian name, an Igbo name. And Equiano would be a name I suspect that he derived from his experiences as an enslaved individual. The name Gustavus Vasa was given to him by one of his owners over the years, and Equiano was owned by several people before he eventually bought his freedom. It's important to keep in mind that Equiano's the date we are thinking about when we think of Equiano would have been born about 1745. So this is in the 18th century, and he would eventually die um, in 1788. At the age of 52 years old. So it's not exactly certain when he was born, the date, but it's around that period. So he lived in the 18th century most of his life. And this is a man who wrote this quite famous memoir that essentially tells the story of his life. But you can see that when we think about it, how it's framed, it's not a memoir written just for him to share the details of his life, and as he explains, but there's a purpose behind it, and there's a way in which the idea of having a purpose for one's articulation, for writing, for the African and the African American, definitely became a very, very, very critical part of a very demanding part of one's rationale for writing. I'm trying to explain this as best as I can, that the idea to write for the pleasure of writing or for writing's sake, so to speak, was not available because of the scarcity of opportunities to write for the African American. And the African American who then wrote with an intention, because of course they knew that they had to use the power of the writing to make change in society and so on. And so what we see in contemporary society is the question of why should African Americans write, or should African Americans be free to write about anything they want to write about, or should they always be writing race work about their culture, race that is liberatory and intended to be liberatory. And it's a topic that we're going to discuss and explore the more and more, especially when we come to listen to read Langston Hughes's The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. But Olaoudah Equiano makes it clear why he's writing the memoir. And he makes it clear from the get-go what the purpose of the memoir is. Now, 1745, this is the height of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. Africans are being brought from Africa to the New World, to the Americas, and they're laboring on plantations, and they're dying in droves. They're dying in great numbers. This is in the height of slavery. Equiano is captured in his story in a village called Isaka in Nigeria, Igbo land. Igbo would have been the clan or the community, in fact, the nation from which he was taken. And as the story goes, he's taken into the New World. He's taken first to the British West Indies, where he's captured, where he's taken and he's enslaved there as a child. Eventually, he's sold to a planter in Virginia, where he lives for some years in Virginia, and this is why we read him as part of African American history of African American literature. He would eventually become sold. He would eventually be sold to a ship captain, who would then take him on tours and taught him how to work on the ship, learn how to sail, but also he was a merchant, and so he learned how to do merchanting work and so on. He was sold a few more times, but the captains who had him allowed him to earn his own money at the same time. So Equiano never actually worked on a plantation. Equiano actually worked as a servant to merchants, as a servant to captains and sailors and so on. And so he learned the skills of sailing. He learned to read and to write. He was taught to read and write, and to do sums and so on and so forth. So he became a merchant, and he was able to buy his freedom. At which point he attempted to. Once he bought the freedom, he was in the West Indies, and he attempted to work there, but he was always aware that at any point he could be recaptured and put back into slavery. So he made his way eventually to England, and essentially lived out his rest of his life in England. Although he did join, he ironically, Equiano became was hired on two occasions. One occasion on a big enterprise, which was a slave holding enterprise, and he was supposed to help organize slaves and pick the right slaves and so on and so forth. He did that for some years. He really hated it, and went back to England. And then later on, in the movement towards the American War of Revolution, as I had said in a previous lecture, the British had made promises to the enslaved Africans in the United States that if they either rebelled and joined forces with the British, they would then look after them. And the British lived up to it. And so what the British had done is set up a colony called Sierra Leone in Africa. And they did two things. One is they took the Maroons, who were the rebellious, successful revolutionary fighters in places like Jamaica. They became guerrilla fighters. Eventually, the British decided that they needed to export them. These were ex-slaves who had escaped. And so they exported many of them to this place called Sierra Leone, which would be the equivalent of Liberia for the Americans, where Americans formed a colony called Liberia in West Africa and decided that they were going to put the blacks, take all blacks and take them there and get them out of America. So the British were doing something similar, but they were then taking people who had been loyal to the British, and placed them there, and also people in Canada who had been loyal to the British in the U.S. who fled to Canada, to Nova Scotia. They went to Sierra Leone, and Equiano was hired by the British government to help establish this colony, which he did for a time, but began to whistleblow on the corruption there, and eventually they forced him to return to England. Equiano continued to work as a anti-slavery advocate and so on. But let's just listen to Equiano, and Equiano sort of laying out why, the rationale for his book, and it's worth listening to the way that Equiano introduces this book, and it's called, I think it's very important. The first thing to note, and you'll see this in the text, is that there's a preface, a kind of letter, a very explicit letter, and it's worth paying attention to who it's addressed to. It's who is this letter addressed to, and the content of the letter. So here's the letter. The letter begins, "To the Lords Spiritual and Temporal, and the Commons of the Parliament of Great Britain." So, to the Lords Spiritual and Temporal, and the Commons of the Parliament of Great Britain. So he was writing to the Parliament of Great Britain. That is, he was writing this book, essentially, to the British government, right? and say he's writing this letter to the British government and presenting the book. The book was essentially addressed to them. They're subscribers to the book because in those days you didn't just publish a book, you had to have a list of people who were subscribing to the book, who promised to buy the book, and who were therefore also endorsing the book. This is what we would call pre-sales, the pre-sales of the book. And that list had all the lords and dukes and reverends and so on and so forth. It's a list of about 200 names. But let's just listen to, if you can just listen to the letter that he writes. He says, "My lords and gentlemen, permit me with the greatest deference and respect to lay at your feet the following genuine narrative, the chief design of which is to excite in your august assemblies a sense of compassion for the miseries which the slave trade has entailed on my unfortunate countrymen. By the horrors of that trade was I first torn away from all the tender connections that were naturally dear to my heart, but these, through the mysterious ways of Providence, I ought to regard as infinitely more than compensated by the introduction I have thence obtained to the knowledge of the Christian religion and of a nation which, by its liberal sentiments, its humanity, the glorious freedom of its government, and its proficiency in arts and sciences, has exalted the dignity of human nature." Okay, so he's laying it down. Now, Equiano is saying that he was enslaved and captured. And he says there's good fortune in it. There's great providence in it because at least he was able to become a Christian. He was able to discover the Christian faith. And then secondly, he was able to observe this great government of leaders who he's writing to. It's interesting because Equiano is intentionally being ironic. Because as the book goes on, he challenges the British government. He even questions the British government. And he's asking the British government, why would they persist on something like slavery? Because the very fact that he's addressing the British government and the British Parliament on a book against slavery means that he, as much as he exalts them to be the glorious people and so on and so forth, he's fundamentally questioning them. He goes on. "I am sensible I ought to entreat your pardon for addressing to you a work so wholly devoid of literary merit, but as the production of an unlettered African who is actuated by the hope of becoming an instrument towards the relief of his suffering countrymen, I trust that such a man pleading in such a cause will be acquitted of boldness and presumption. May the God of heaven inspire your hearts with peculiar benevolence on that important day when the question of abolition is to be discussed, when thousands, in consequence of your determination, are to look for happiness or misery." So he's saying, forgive me for writing this. And he says there's this self-deprecation. I'm an unlettered man. I'm a completely useless person. I can't write. I'm wholly devoid of literary merit. But the hope is that they would pay attention to it. Equiano knows that, of course, this is a work of great literary merit. He's an unlettered man, but of course he's writing, so he has letters. He has the ability to write these letters. But it's a way of humbling himself. It's a mannered approach. It's the humility, the gestures and the manners of humility, the rituals of humility that he's presenting. Equiano understands them, and he understands how they function in Britain at the time. But notice what he says: "May the God of heaven inspire your hearts with peculiar benevolence on that important day when the question of abolition is to be discussed." And what has been happening at the time, because this is Olaoudah Equiano, "My lords and gentlemen, your most obedient and devoted humble servant, Olaoudah Equiano or Gustavus Vassa." When he wrote that, already for about 20 to 30 years before that, there are many individuals who had been petitioning and fighting to try and get the Parliament of Britain to start debates about whether slavery should continue or whether slavery should be abolished and slavery should end. And he's saying he's hoping for the day when that debate will start. By the time of his death, 1885, the parliamentary debates on slavery had already started. And by the end of that century, the British had decided to abolish the slave trade, and then by 1838, they decided to abolish slavery. So it took another 40, 50 years after Equiano wrote this, but this was his intention in writing this. So I thought it's worth paying attention to. So who is his audience? Remember, the narrative is being written for them. He's writing his story for the people who have power to liberate the enslaved people. And the understanding who your audience is then tells you about the ways in which the rhetoric and the discussions and the thoughts and the ideas are working. Equiano is writing an argument to the people, the white Europeans, British people, with the power and the capacity to bring about the abolition of slavery. So everything is geared around that idea, right? And I think it's very important to pay attention to it. Okay, there are three passages that I'm going to explore it to some extent. And so here's the second one. And this second one is the opening of the work. This is chapter 1. And let's just see how he positions himself in this piece. He says, I believe it is difficult for those who publish their own memoirs to escape the imputation of vanity. It's a beautiful constructed idea. Of course, this is a man writing at that time where he says he realizes that some people will call him vain to be writing his own memoir. Nor is this the only disadvantage under which they labor. It is also their misfortune that what is uncommon is rarely, if ever, believed, and what is obvious are apt to turn from with disgust and to change the writer with to charge the writer with impertinence. So he's saying that people will either not believe anything I've said, and then if they do believe what I've said, they will think I've been rude and impertinent and offensive. And throughout the book, he keeps saying, my lords, please forgive me. I do not mean to offend you. Dear reader, please forgive me. I know this is an ugly story. I know this is violent. I don't mean to offend you. I don't mean to disturb you. I don't mean to offend you. But the truth is ugly and the truth is painful. So he's preparing people for that. He said, people generally think these memoirs only worthy to be read or remembered which abound in great or striking events, those in short which in a high degree excite either admiration or pity, or all others they consign to contempt and oblivion. It is therefore, I confess, not a little hazardous in a private and obscure individual, and a stranger too, thus to solicit the indulgent attention of the public, especially when I offer here the history of neither a saint, a hero, nor a tyrant. So he's saying, I know that what I'm doing is bold. You people don't know me. I'm a stranger, and I'm not a saint. I'm not a hero, and I'm not a tyrant. I'm not a great leader, a great evil leader. So I have nothing dramatic to share with you. I believe there are few events in my life which have not happened to many. It is true that incidents of it were numerous, and did I consider myself an European, I might say my sufferings were great. But when I compare my lot with that of most of my countrymen, I regard myself as a particular favorite of heaven, and acknowledge the mercies of providence in every occurrence of my life. If then the following narrative does not appear sufficiently interesting to engage general attention, let my motive be some excuse for its publication. I'm not so foolishly vain as to expect from it either immortality or literary reputation. If it affords any satisfaction to my numerous friends at whose request it has been written, or in the smallest degree promotes the interest of humanity, the ends for which it was undertaken will be fully attained, and every wish of my heart gratified. Let it therefore be remembered that in wishing to avoid censure, I do not aspire to praise. So Equiano is saying, I first of all, one, there may be some things that have happened to me that are painful and that are difficult. But he says, if I was European, if I was a white man, it would really look like something horrible. But he says, most of my countrymen, that is, those people who are enslaved like me, that is normal. That's their normal life. Right? And so then he asked the question, why am I doing this? And he says, one, he's doing it to satisfy the people who asked him to write it. Those are his friends. And then he said he's also doing it because he wants to get the smallest degree in which it can promote the interests of humanity. The interests of humanity. So Equiano's task, and throughout this book, he's constantly asking the question, are these people not human beings? Are we not human beings? Do we not value humanity? Do we not value the human being and the African? Remember, these are the people, Equiano included, that Bartholomew de las Casas made a declaration. The jury is out on whether they have souls and whether they can be saved. Equiano lays it out from the beginning. I thank God that I came to this religion. I have a soul, and that soul could be found. Equiano would go through this book in very interesting ways, looking at his Igbo society and comparing it with British society, comparing it with Western society, and comparing it with slave societies in the West Indies and in the Americas. And he would say that, look, my people had laws, my people had systems of operation, my people have proper leadership, proper sanitation. And he would make a comparison and talk about washing and cleaning and the hygiene of Africans in Igbo land compared to Europeans who he said were not hygienic, who he said didn't have the kind of practices about the ways in which they looked after their life in the ways that our people were. He says, these are the people you call savage and you call brute, but you do not understand. It's not that you don't understand them, you just haven't seen that. And he says, no, we have an organized civilization, and that civilization was being destroyed willfully. And that civilization was being denigrated falsely, and Equiano was there to prove it otherwise. I think this is really one of the most powerful elements in the work, where he goes into the practices of his community, the ways in which language is used, the ways in which power operates, the ways in which elections are held, people are, put into positions of power, the ways in which monarchs are organized, and so on. And he does this very subtle comparison with Western society and European society. And his argument is that there is nothing secondary. There is nothing. There's nothing lesser about this society that we are talking about. The people that you're describing as savage are people who live lives of exemplary beauty and civilization, artistry, and grace, and carrying all the values that you yourself carry as Europeans, and it's quite powerful. Okay, I want to end this lecture with going to the end of Equiano's thing. The third quote that I thought is worth reading is Equiano ends this piece by addressing the queen, the queen of England, and it's a very interesting address because it's a petition, right? On behalf of him and his people. So he says, March the 21st, 1788, I had the honor of presenting the Queen with a petition on behalf of my African brethren, which was received most graciously by Her Majesty. And this is the petition that he made. And I read it because I think it's important to understand that that is the context in which this whole narrative is being written. Equiano is on the make. He's on the go. He's trying to make the case. Free the people. End slavery. So here he is. To the Queen, most excellent Majesty, Madame, Your Majesty's well-known benevolence and humanity emboldens me to approach your royal presence, trusting that the obscurity of my situation will not prevent your Majesty from attending to the sufferings for which I plead. Yet I do not solicit your royal pity for my own distress, my sufferings, although numerous are in a measure forgotten. I supplicate your Majesty's compassion for millions of my African countrymen who groan under the lash of tyranny in the West Indies. The oppression and cruelty exercised to the unhappy Negroes there have at length reached the British legislature, and they are now deliberating on its redress. Even several persons of property in slaves in the West Indies have petitioned Parliament against its continuance, sensible that it is as impolite as it is unjust, and what is inhuman must ever be unwise. Your Majesty's reign has been hitherto distinguished by private acts of benevolence and honesty. Surely, the more extended the misery is the greater claim it has to your Majesty's compassion, and the greater must be your Majesty's pleasure in administering it to its relief. I presume, therefore, gracious Queen, to implore your interposition with your royal consort in favor of the wretched Africans, that by your Majesty's benevolent influence a period may now be put to their misery, and that they may be raised from the condition of brutes to which they are at present degraded to the rights and situation of freemen, and admitted to partake of the blessings of your Majesty's happy government. So shall your Majesty enjoy the heartfelt pleasure of procuring happiness to millions, and be rewarded in the grateful prayers of themselves and of their posterity. And may the all-bountiful Creator shower on your Majesty, the royal family, every blessing that this world can afford, and every fullness of joy which divine revelation has promised us in the next. I am your Majesty's most dutiful and devoted servant to command, Gustavus Vasa, the oppressed Ethiopian. So this is the letter that he writes to the Majesty. And it's a very interesting thing because, of course, Equiano is presenting this to the Queen at the time when the thing that he had anticipated, remember I said that there was the anticipation of what was going to come. The thing that he had anticipated was that there's going to be the debate in Parliament surrounding the question of slavery. And he says, as we speak now, as I'm writing this, this is being debated in the British Parliament, right? And Equiano is making the case to the Queen. He's making the case to the Queen that she should simply end slavery. She should end slavery and release the people who have been enslaved, for once and for all. And he's making the case that eventually that act of freeing the slave will bring blessing. Well, truth is, it doesn't happen. And like I said, it doesn't happen for many years. And in fact, it doesn't happen until 1838. And the reason it does eventually happen, of course, is because of the work of the enslaved people themselves, who fought the British, fought the slave owners, fought the plantation, and worked as hard as they could to secure their own slavery, their own freedom from slavery. And it's a very fascinating moment in the struggle for the freedom of Africans. So this was the letter that he wrote, not to she was the Queen. She was the Queen, George III's wife, and the hope was that she would influence. Very tellingly, he writes to the wife of the king, uh, with the hope that she would influence the king to bring about the ending of slavery. Equiano would eventually die. He died in England. He got married. He had married a British woman, and he had two children. One of his children died relatively young. The other went on to outlive him. Inherited a lot of his properties because he had some properties and so on and so forth. The lineage of Equiano is not clear what happened after that. Equiano's, Britain has recognized that Equiano's memoir, his slave narrative, his slave memoir, was was very influential in swinging British thought and British thinking and the British populace against slavery, because it painted the picture of the unreasonableness of the enslavement of Africans, and so it had a part to play. And I think it's worth paying attention to. One of the things that we'll talk about in tomorrow is what this form of address, this form of rhetorical intervention represents in terms of a poetics, in terms of a kind of literary practice and literary structure that would become influential to so many people. There are ways in which you read this petition and then you think of, say, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, the appeal of that, the way that it's constructed, the way that is appealed, and how similar these things are. That rhetoric travels over centuries for the petitioning of individuals to see about the freedom of Africans in the New World. So we'll talk more.